Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us on this cold day. Welcome to Poets as Smugglers, Sutzkever Kaczerginski, and How the Remnants of the YIVO Archive Reached New York. The YIVO Bard Winter Program on Ashkenazi Civilization, keynote address by Dr. David Fishman. My name is Helena Gindi. I'm the Public Program Director here at YIVO. Jonathan Brent, YIVO's Executive Director, unfortunately could not attend tonight, but does send his regards. Tonight's program kicks off the fourth YIVO Bard Winter Program on Ashkenazi Civilization, which began today and runs through January 23rd. This program, the first of its kind in the U.S., presents an integrated curriculum of the culture, history, language, and literature of East European Jews with public classes open to all. For more information, please reach out to YIVO's Director of Education, Jennifer Young, or visit yivo.org. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Fishman, is the Jacob Cronehill Visiting Scholar in East European Jewish History at YIVO for spring 2015. Dr. Fishman is the second Jacob Cronehill Visiting Scholar at YIVO, a position supported by the Cronehill Pletka Foundation. We would like to thank and gratefully acknowledge the foundation for their support for this position and really wonderful opportunity. While Dr. Fishman is in residence, he will teach a public evening course on the history of Vilna and will convene an advanced research seminar for graduate students. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Fishman and his work. Dr. Fishman is professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary, teaching courses in modern Jewish history. He also serves as director of Project Judaica, a Jewish studies program based in Moscow and Kiev, co-sponsored by JTS and local universities. Dr. Fishman is the author of numerous books and articles on the history and culture of East European Jewry. His books include Russia's First Modern Jews, published by New York University Press, and The Rise of Modern Yiddish Culture, published by Pittsburgh University Press. He is the co-editor of From Mesopotamia to Modernity, 10 Introductions to Jewish History and Literature by Westview Press. For 15 years, from 1988 to 2003, Dr. Fishman was editor-in-chief of YIVO Blätter, the Yiddish language scholarly journal of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. More recently, he edited a volume of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik's Yiddish writings and discourses based on original handwritten manuscripts. He serves on the academic committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the editorial boards of Jewish Social Studies and Polin. Dr. Fishman travels frequently to Moscow and other parts of the former Soviet Union on behalf of Project Judaica. He directs its Jewish Archival Survey, which locates and describes Jewish archival materials in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. He is now completing a book on the rescue of Vilna's Jewish cultural treasures from the Nazis and Soviets, a topic he first explored in the YIVO-published brochure Embers Plucked from the Fire. Lastly, if you enjoy our programs and our work, please do consider becoming a YIVO member today. We rely on your support to continue our work. To register today, visit the YIVO table in the Great Hall after this program. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fishman to the stage.
Thank you, Helena. And good evening to all of you. Thank you for coming. And I do want to also express my thanks, actually, first to Irene Pletka and the Cronehill Pletka Foundation for creating this position. And I'm very honored and I'm very excited about my tenure as Cronehill visiting professor this coming semester at YIVO. I'd also like to thank Etty Goldwasser for helping prepare my PowerPoint that I'll give to you as I read my talk. Let's see if I can get this going. Okay, we'll start there. As you may know, 2015 marks YIVO's 90th anniversary. And in honor of that occasion, I'd like to share with you a dramatic chapter in YIVO's history, which, while known in its general contours, has never been fully told. This is the story how the Vilna Yiddish poets Avrom Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginski, with the help of friends, smuggled remnants of the Vilna YIVO's library and archive and other Jewish cultural treasures out of post-war Soviet Vilnius and sent them off to the reconstituted YIVO here in New York. This story has never been told because its main actors, Sutzkever, Kaczerginski, and YIVO director Max Weinreich, agreed that it should not be told, that telling it could cause serious negative repercussions for them and for YIVO. Today, those smuggled documents are concentrated in a single archival collection, RG-223, called the Sutzkever-Kaczerginski collection, and the smuggled books are scattered across YIVO's library collection, cataloged by author and title. Among the materials are the Diary of Theodor Herzl between 1883 and 1887, the record book of the Vilna Gaon's synagogue, letters by classic Hebrew and Yiddish writers, including Sholem Aleichem and Chaim Nachman Bialik, and a part of the archive of the Vilna Ghetto Administration, including a run of the official newspaper of the Vilna Ghetto, Ghetto Yedias. As background, allow me to review, at least in brief, the fate of Vilna's Jewish cultural treasures before, during, and immediately after the war, for those who may not be familiar with it. And then I will turn to the story of how Yiddish poets became smugglers, and how that story unfolded in Vilna and Moscow, Lodz and Warsaw, Paris and New York. Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, had three great Jewish repositories, collections. First was the Strashun Library, which housed the finest collection of Hebrew books and periodicals in Eastern Europe, and which belonged to the Vilna Jewish community, to the Kehillah. Second was the Ansky Museum of the Jewish Historical Ethnographic Society, which had an impressive collection of Jewish art, artifacts, rare books, older documents, such as Pinkasim, the minute books of Jewish communities and associations. And third, there was the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, which had an extraordinary library of Yiddish books and periodicals and a rich archive on Jewish life in Eastern Europe, mainly from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. When the Germans entered Vilna in late June 1941, they not only began persecuting and murdering its Jews, but they also began looting its Jewish collections and shipping select treasures to Germany. In Germany, the materials were to be exploited by the budding field of anti-Semitic Jewish studies known as Judenforschung. Its purpose was to justify in scientific terms the persecution, ghettoization, and extermination of the Jews. Its slogan was Judenforschung ohne Juden, study of the Jews without Jews. In February 1942, the main Nazi German agency charged with looting Jewish cultural treasures, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, set up a working group in Vilna. It was headed, this looting agency in Vilna, by Dr. Johannes Paul, a Nazi Judenforschung specialist who had once taken courses at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The Rosenberg Stab Working Group seized control of the YIVO building at 18 Vivulskiva Street and engaged 20 Jewish slave laborers to sort Vilna's Jewish cultural treasures into two categories: those materials to be sent to Germany for Judenforschung, and those materials to be sent to their destruction. The group of Jewish slave laborers was headed by Vilna Ghetto librarian Hermann Kruk and by YIVO scholar Zelig Kalmanovich. The group was nicknamed by ghetto inmates the Paper Brigade. The members of the Paper Brigade, and most notably the young Yiddish poets who belonged to it, Sutzkever and Kaczerginski, decided to foil the Germans' designs. They hid thousands of books, manuscripts and documents from the Germans, to prevent both their deportation to Germany and their destruction. Mostly, they concealed the material on their bodies at the end of the workday, and they smuggled them back into the ghetto past the guards, Jewish, Lithuanian, and German guards. Once in the ghetto, the members of the paper brigade buried the material in bunkers and hiding places. They handed other materials over to Polish and Lithuanian friends for safekeeping. This dangerous operation lasted 1.5 years, until shortly before the liquidation of the Vilna ghetto in September 1943, when Vilna's last 15,000 surviving inmates were sent to labor camps, death camps, and the mass murder site at Ponar. Most members of the paper brigade perished, including its leaders, Kruk and Kalmanovich. But Kaczergiński and Sutzkever, these young poets, survived, and they returned to Vilna when the city was liberated by the Red Army in July 1944. And with the help of a group of friends and volunteers, they dug up the materials from their bunkers and hiding places. They also retrieved underground the archive of the Vilna ghetto, which had been meticulously accumulated by Kruk. Sutzkever and Kaczergiński established an institution to house these materials and others that had miraculously been spared from destruction. It was the Vilna Jewish Museum, under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. The ministry provided space for the museum in heavily damaged buildings within the boundaries of the former Nazi-imposed ghetto, in what had been the ghetto library, the ghetto prison, and the ghetto bathhouse, and surrounding it the courtyard of what had been the ghetto sports field. This institution, the Jewish Museum, amassed so many books, manuscripts, and documents that many of them were kept piles in mountains in the courtyard. Sutzkever played a key role in the retrieval operation during the first 6 weeks, from July till early September 1944, but then he returned to Moscow to engage in his literary activities. After his departure, his friend Kaczergiński became the museum's director. But within less than a year's time, Kaczergiński, a long-standing communist sympathizer, lost his faith that there was any future for Jewish life in Soviet Vilnius. The local authorities refused to allow publication of a Yiddish newspaper in Vilnius, or of magazine, or of books, or to even permit the creation of a Yiddish theater. The one Jewish school and orphanage was forced to change its location 3 times in the first year of its existence, as its buildings were repeatedly handed over to other institutions. For months, the Jewish Museum had no budget. It was briefly closed down in the fall of 1944, then reopened with a staff of 3 people, plus a secretary and a janitor. But even after its reopening, the authorities continued to obstruct the museum's operation. Kaczergiński couldn't even obtain glass to install windows in the museum's blown-out buildings. Publication of a promotional brochure about the museum's activities was blocked. Then one night, the sanitation department removed one of the mountains of cultural treasures kept outdoors and sent it to be incinerated. Finally, representatives of the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, visited the museum and told Kaczergiński that he was forbidden to share its holdings with the public, at least until the books and documents passed through censorship. But there were no Yiddish reading censors in the Censorship Bureau. Kaczergiński complained bitterly about the hostile attitude towards Jewish culture in Soviet Lithuania. He contacted the heads of the Lithuanian Communist Party, including Henryk Zeman, who was the Jewish editor of Tiesa, the Lithuanian equivalent of Pravda, the the main newspaper. But Zeman considered his own Jewishness a liability, best left unmentioned, and he became annoyed by Kaczerginski's pestering. Shmerke also wrote letters to Moscow, to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, the main Soviet Jewish organization in Moscow. And he used a visit to Vilnius by the chairman of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, Shlomo Michoels, the director of the Yiddish Theater in Moscow, to press his case with authorities. But it was all to no avail. Kaczerginski described his moment of epiphany in his account of his Soviet experiences called Zwischen Hammer und Serb. I quote, "We, the group of museum activists, had a bizarre realization. We must save the treasures again and get them out of here. Otherwise, they will disappear and perish. In the best of cases, they will not see the light of day in the Jewish world." In Kaczerginski's vivid image, the Jewish cultural treasures had been rescued from Nazi extermination, but they were now held in a Soviet prison camp. After 8 months of struggle, Shmerke Kaczerginski decided to leave Soviet Vilnius for Poland and to take out of the country as many Jewish cultural treasures as possible. As a former Polish citizen, he was entitled to repatriate to Poland. But smuggling the materials out of Soviet Lithuania was no less dangerous and life-threatening than it had been to smuggle them out of the Rosenbergstab work site in the ghetto. It needed to be done with great care and caution. Kaczerginski shared his plans with just a few close friends. In late April 1945, he wrote to Sutzkever in Moscow, "I'm going to travel to Aunt Lola in 5-6 weeks from now." Aunt Lola was a code word for Lodz in Poland, the main destination for Polish Jewish repatriates. Of course, Kaczerginski's time frame was utterly unrealistic. He needed much more time than 5-6 weeks to resign as director, find a successor as director of the Jewish Museum, get all the permits to emigrate, and most of all, to organize the removal and the transfer of the museum materials. On August 1st, 1945, Kaczerginski resigned as museum's director, and he was succeeded by his own childhood friend, Janko Gutkovich. But Kaczerginski remained on the staff of the museum even after he was no longer director, ostensibly to assist in the transition. But unbeknownst to Gutkovich and the other staff members, Shmerke was secretly removing items from the premises and squirreling them away, either in his own apartment or in hiding places inside the museum itself. According to an account by Chaim Grade, a fellow Jung Vilna Yiddish poet, Kaczerginski gave small envelopes and packages to his many friends and acquaintances who were repatriating to Poland and gave them instructions: hold on to the packages until I arrive. One such instance is documented. In July 1945, Kaczerginski sent a package of materials with friends to Rochel Pupko-Krinsky, his colleague from the paper brigade, and also his romantic interest. Rochel Pupko-Krinsky was then in Lodz, and the package included Theodor Herzl's diary and other rarities. And in the letter to Rochel, he gave her strict orders. She was not to tell anyone about the package. She should not hand over its contents to anyone unless the person gave her a note from him with the code phrase, Schweik has requested. Schweik was an acronym for Shmerke Kaczerginski. Kaczerginski himself left Vilnius suddenly in late November 1945, without so much as saying goodbye to his childhood friend and successor, Gutkovich. According to Chaim Grade's account, a museum staff member came into Kaczerginski's office one day, shook his hand, and said to him, "Have a good trip. You're leaving today, right?" When Shmerke answered that he had no such plans, the staff member remarked, that the director of the museum had just been summoned to the Ministry of Culture to give a detailed accounting of the museum's manuscripts and rare books. And then the staff member added suggestively, "I'm sure that Comrade Zeman of the Central Committee is mistaken in his assessment that you are an enemy of the Soviet Union." Kaczerginski got the hint. He had been marked for arrest. He left Vilnius the same day. Because his departure was so sudden, unexpected, he was only able to take a little bit of material with him across the border. It was up to Sutzkever, who still remained in Moscow, to retrieve the remainder. Sutzkever had actually sent select treasures directly to YIVO in New York, well before Kaczerginski was funneling material over to Poland. When he left in September 1944 back for Moscow, he took with him documents that had been dug up from a bunker on Shavel Street. He may have wanted to just show those items to his fellow Yiddish writers in Moscow, and he probably was emotionally invested in the materials and simply could not part with them. But it's also likely that he hoped that he would find a way to forward the materials to YIVO's director in New York, Max Weinreich. And his first opportunity to do so presented itself in December of 1944, when Sutzkever was interviewed by a pro-Soviet journalist for the New York Post named Ella Winter. In the course of the interview, he told Winter about YIVO, about the Rosenbergstab, about the heroic work of the Paper Brigade, and about the recent excavations in Vilna. Noticing her strong emotional reaction, Sutzkever asked Winter, who was about to leave for New York in just a few days, to deliver an envelope of materials to Weinreich. He explained to her Weinreich was YIVO's sole surviving director, the man who had rebuilt the Institute in America. He gave her an envelope in which he inserted a document from the archive of Shimon Dubnov, the Dean of East European Jewish Historians. Not knowing Weinreich's address or telephone number in New York, Sutzkever gave Winter the following instructions. Take this package to 183 East Broadway, to the offices of the Yiddish newspaper Der Tog. Someone there will give you Max Weinreich's telephone number. Call him from there and wait. Do not give the package to anyone else. Don't mention it to anyone else. Just call and wait, and may God bless you. Winter followed Sutzkever's instructions, and Weinreich reacted exactly as he had expected. He told her to stay where she was. He would come immediately. Weinreich collected the package, and with it a short letter from Sutzkever. I send you regards from our destruction. Your wife's mother, Mrs. Shabbat, lived in the ghetto almost the entire 2 years of its existence. In August 1943, she died in her own bed, the greatest joy of a ghetto person. I rescued a part of your archive and library. Not everything survived under the ground. It's hard to write. My heart is on the verge of bursting. Sutzkever. Upon returning to the YIVO building at West 123rd Street, then YIVO was on West 123rd Street, Weinreich invited 3 members of the YIVO leadership into his office, Chief Librarian Mendel Elkin, Historian Yankiv Shatsky, and the chairman of YIVO's academic board, the educator Leiber Schlerer. He unraveled the package, and the 4 men touched the pages. They bowed their heads and broke down in tears. In the spring of 1945, Sutzkever sent the second package to Weinreich with the Canadian journalist Raymond Davis. And then he sent his third package in February 1946, this time from Nuremberg, Germany, which he visited as part of the Soviet delegation to testify at the Nuremberg Tribunal against Nazi war criminals. There, he found a courier who was a personal acquaintance of Weinreich's, Benjamin Wald, who served as a translator for the American delegation at Nuremberg. Sutzkever gave Wald 3 letters by Sholem Aleichem and an appended short letter. I carried these letters through the ghetto, through fire and swamps, underground and in the air. Please hold on to them at your home until I can pick them up in person. Warm regards to the entire staff of YIVO. Sutzkever meant that phrase, until I can pick them up in person, quite seriously. While Weinreich was moved to tears by Sutzkever's mailings, he didn't lose his even-tempered cool. He knew that writing to Moscow to acknowledge receipt of the packages was exactly the wrong thing to do. His letters would be read by Soviet censors, and that would raise suspicions about Sutzkever, his activities and contacts. So Weinreich waited patiently and did not write. Sutzkever, meanwhile, visited Vilna twice more in 1946, after Kaczerginski had already left for Poland. And during those visits, he ostensibly worked on behalf of the Jewish Museum. In fact, he was secretly working to remove materials from the Jewish Museum. Kaczerginski wrote to him from Poland with instructions on where certain items were located. I quote a letter from Kaczerginski to Sutzkever. In the courtyard of the Jewish Museum, under the stairwell, where the Torah scrolls are piled, I buried Kruk's diary. Be sure to find it. Sutzkever left for Poland in May 1946. Exactly how he smuggled materials across the Soviet-Polish border is unclear. In the letters he sent from Lodz, he only related that the operation involved countless difficulties and life-threatening dangers. It is likely that the Bricha, the underground Zionist operation to transfer Jews to Palestine, helped move the books and the documents across the border. The Bricha was active in Soviet Lithuania in 1946, and as we shall see, Sutzkever availed himself of their services later on. These materials were simply too voluminous to be carried out by a single person. On the day Sutzkever arrived in Poland, he dispatched a letter to Weinreich, and he dropped the bombshell. Everything he had sent so far was just a drop in the bucket. He had suitcases full of materials, several thousand items, and he informed Weinreich that he and Kaczerginski agreed to send the materials to YIVO. But Sutzkever asked for something in return. He wanted Weinreich to arrange for him and Kaczerginski to come to New York, together with the materials, to settle in America. I quote, I know that it won't be easy for us to be admitted to America, but YIVO would do a great thing for YIVO, not to mention for the two of us, if you brought us over. Without us, the materials, especially the ghetto materials, won't be decipherable in any case. Weinreich replied by telegram, I received your letters. I also received the previous 3 mailings. I will do everything in my power to help you. Warm regards to you and to the Kaczerginskis. In Weinreich's subsequent letters, his expressions of gratitude towards his former student, Sutzkever had been his student, were tempered by the emotional restraint and touch of formality that was befitting for a Litvak. Weinreich began his letters to Sutzkever with, my dear friend, but he addressed Sutzkever with the formal pronoun, ihr, rather than du. On the matter of immigration visas, Weinreich's initial optimism gradually waned. By August 1946, he was urging patience and realism. I would do who knows what to help you, but my who knows what isn't who knows what. Meanwhile, Sutzkever continued to send sample documents from Lodz using various couriers, staff members of the Joint Distribution Committee, a visiting delegation of American rabbis, and so on. With the pogrom in Kelts on July 4th, 1946, Sutzkever's and Kaczerginski's plans suddenly changed. leaving Poland became a matter of urgency. 47 Jews were killed in Kielce, and 50 more were wounded in the attack, which topped off a year in which more than 350 Jews were killed in Poland in anti-Semitic violence. After Kielce, Polish Jews were thrust into fear and panic. Kaczerginski and Sutzkever drew the personal conclusion that they must leave as soon as possible. And apart from the pogrom and the attacks, they were also mindful of the fact that the Communist Party was gradually taking control of Poland. Other political parties were being marginalized, and this did not augur well for Jewish life in Poland. Sutzkever and Kaczerginski had fled Soviet Vilnius, but now the Soviets were catching up with them. The writers were fortunate to obtain French visas. On a personal level, this was great news. But it also meant that Sutzkever and Kaczerginski needed to smuggle their suitcases packed with Jewish cultural treasures across yet another communist-controlled border. Sutzkever this time turned to help for the Bricha, and this time we have a very detailed account of how the Bricha did its job. The assignment of smuggling the Vilna archive from Poland to Czechoslovakia was entrusted to David Plonsky, the young man in the white jacket. A former fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, known by his code name Jurek. Jurek was now a Bricha organizer. Plonsky's superiors, one of them being in this picture, Antek Zuckerman to the left, the superiors told him that the archive contained valuable documents from the ghetto and annihilation, and that they would eventually be sent to Eretz Yisrael. Now, crossing the Polish-Czech border was the easy part of the operation. But once inside Czechoslovakia, with stuffed suitcases, Plonsky was worried that his foreign accent would give him away, and his unfamiliarity with the country would give him away to authorities. The plan was to perform a handoff at the Prague train station. Sutzkever would take the train from Warsaw to Paris on an agreed-upon date, and Plonsky would meet him during the train's brief stop-off in Prague, and he would give him 2 suitcases to take to Paris. The operation needed to be performed with precision and speed. On the appointed date, the train station was packed with passengers, but also with policemen. And as the Paris-bound train rolled into the station, Plonsky spotted Sutzkever's head sticking out of the train window. He approached the train car with the suitcases in hand, but a policeman detected him. An arm grabbed at Plonsky's clothes as he thrust the suitcases over his shoulders and through the window. Plonsky shook himself free from the policeman and jumped into the train car. He said a few words to Sutzkever, then jumped out the window on the other side of the car, dashed into a tunnel, and disappeared into a crowd of passengers. The train whistled out of the station. The operation was a success. When Plonsky returned to a local Bricha safe house that evening, comrades from the movement asked him what he was doing in Prague. He replied, "I've contributed my part to Jewish history." Kaczerginski and Sutzkever were overjoyed to breathe the free air of Paris. There was a dynamic Jewish cultural life there, an active association of Vilna Jews, but both of them considered Paris to be just another transit point. Where they would go next was open and unclear. Upon arrival, late November 1946, Sutzkever wrote to Weinreich again to express his continued desire to settle in New York. Weinreich put him in touch with YIVO's representative in Paris, Gershon Epstein. And Epstein reported to Weinreich about his first meeting with Sutzkever. He showed me the materials he's rescued. Letters from amazing personalities, lots of treasures from YIVO, the Strashun Library, religious books. He's rescued diaries. More and more, the material could fill entire crates. While in Paris, Sutzkever considered the possibility of sending the materials to the Library of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. But his closest friend in America, the Yiddish poet Aaron Glantz Leelis, discouraged him from doing that. I quote, "Here in New York, the cultural treasures will be located among living Jews, and they'll have living value. In the Jerusalem University, they will, under current circumstances, be relics, and the attitude toward them will be far from brotherly and warm." From Paris, Sutzkever continued to send packages to YIVO through all sorts of couriers. The traffic between New York and Paris was so great, it became difficult for Weinreich to keep track of who was carrying materials. Sutzkever didn't always provide exact names. One traveler failed to pick up the materials that Sutzkever left for him in Paris offices of the JDC. Another traveler took the material but failed to contact Weinreich when he arrived in New York. The system needed to be changed. At the end of January 1947, Weinreich wrote to Sutzkever, "Communal leaders and journalists are the worst couriers one can imagine." Weinreich's preferred means of shipment was via YIVO's Paris representative, Gershon Epstein, whom he totally trusted. And between mid-December 1946 and March 1947, YIVO received 360 documents from Sutzkever via Epstein. Sutzkever and Kaczerginski each had their own separate stashes of material that they released gradually to Epstein. Both of them had sections of Zelig Kalmanovich's Vilna Ghetto diary. Shmerke handed over his part in February 1947. But Sutzkever held on to his part of the diary until July 1947, and he relinquished it only after numerous pleas from Epstein and Weinreich. This was typical. Sutzkever was reluctant to give up the most valuable or emotionally charged treasures. Weinreich could barely restrain his exasperation in his letters. It was only in August 1947, after 9 months in Paris, that Sutzkever finally gave up the record book of the Vilna Gaon's synagogue, after repeated requests. And in violation of all archival norms, Sutzkever wrote a dedication on the manuscript's first page, as if it was as much his manuscript as the Vilna Gaon's. With Sutzkever, Kaczerginski, and the materials safely in Paris, far away from the USSR and the Soviet bloc, a new question arose. How should YIVO inform the public about the rescue and retrieval of the Vilna treasures? A dramatic event of this magnitude deserved to be publicized, and its heroes deserved to be celebrated. But, as Weinreich wrote to the two of them, quote, "There are weighty reasons not to speak about the matter with complete openness. It is important that the matter be conveyed in a slightly disguised manner." It isn't hard to reconstruct Weinreich's concerns. If the full story were publicized, the Soviet government might launch a campaign for the material's return to the Soviet Union, on the grounds that YIVO was in possession of the stolen property of a Soviet museum, the Vilnius Jewish Museum. At the very least, Jewish communists, of which there were many then, would begin a campaign to vilify Sutzkever, Kaczerginski, and YIVO as partners in crime. These concerns were well-founded when the much larger trove of YIVO materials were discovered in Germany. The material that had been shipped to Germany for Judenforschung was discovered in and around Frankfurt in the American-occupied zone. The director of the Vilna Jewish Museum, Gutkovich, pressed Soviet government agencies, including the Foreign Ministry of the USSR, to demand that the books and documents in Germany be returned to Vilnius. Gutkovich wrote to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in Moscow, quote, "We have reason to suspect that some groups have set their sights on this Soviet property, first and foremost the YIVO in America. We ask you to take all necessary action for the return of this Soviet property." Only after extensive legal and political work did Weinreich persuade the U.S. government that the New York YIVO was the direct continuation of the Vilna YIVO, and it was the rightful owner of its property. But Weinreich knew that YIVO's claim to the documents from the Vilna ghetto was weak or dubious. The ghetto materials had never belonged to YIVO. After all, YIVO had been dissolved by the Germans before the ghetto documents were even composed. The only rightful owner of the ghetto materials was the Vilnius Jewish Museum, a Soviet state institution. And besides wanting to avoid a diplomatic row, Weinreich was also eager to maintain YIVO's nonpartisan position in the Yiddish-speaking community, its standing as an institution that brought together scholars, supporters, and members of the public who held various political views. He was concerned that the full disclosure of the story would generate hostility toward YIVO among the Yiddish left and would weaken the institution's broad-based support. So with YIVO now based in the United States, and its former headquarters, Vilna, now incorporated into the Soviet Union, it was unavoidable that the remnants of YIVO's collections would be embroiled in Cold War politics. Sutzkever had also similar concerns. Jewish communists might launch personal attacks on him, portray him as a thief, not as a rescuer. As soon as Sutzkever left Poland, he received a letter from a colleague warning him, quote, "In certain circles, there's been a total reversal of the attitude toward you. People are saying Sutzkever impoverished Vilna. He stole the most precious treasures. We need to deal with this." And the author of that letter warned Sutzkever that the people who were making these accusations had no doubt shared them with their ideological comrades in Paris. Colleague warned Sutzkever against keeping any museum materials in his Paris apartment, just in case Jewish communists organized a break-in to retrieve them. Unlike Sutzkever, Kaczerginski was never one to shy away from a fight. Soon after arriving in Lodz, he declared at a general meeting of the Association of Yiddish Writers in Poland that Yiddish culture in the Soviet Union was being systematically liquidated, that Soviet Yiddish culture had no future. So he was on their blacklist to begin with. A few years later, when Kaczerginski published his account of his Soviet experiences, and he mentioned his rescue of the cultural treasures, Jewish communists released their full fury against him. And I'll quote here an article from a Yiddish communist paper about Kaczerginski's memoirs. Quote, "He looted the State Museum where he was the responsible custodian. The USSR paid him a salary to guard the museum materials, but he quietly started, quote, rescuing them without the slightest sense of honesty, ethics, and loyalty. He justified his acts by sacrilegiously identifying Sovietness with Nazism. Needless to say, the dishonesty of the Kaczerginskis led the state organs to view with suspicion the potential Schmerkes that might have remained behind in the country. And this caused serious harm to Soviet Jews." All of these considerations were behind the mutual agreement between the parties that YIVO not publicize the fact that it had received these materials from Sutzkever and Kaczerginski. In the first half of 1947, YIVO News only mentioned in a general way the Institute was in possession of materials from pre-war Vilna that, quote, had been rescued. YIVO News did not explain who had rescued the materials or how they had reached New York. The lead article of the September 1947 issue of YIVO News, Yedias von YIVO, informed readers the Institute had acquired 3 extraordinary diaries: Theodor Herzl's diary from the 1880s, and the diaries of Zelig Kalmanovich and Hermann Kruk from the Vilna Ghetto. And the article noted how they arrived at YIVO. That is a separate dramatic story, which we will relate in detail on another occasion. The question was so sensitive that discussions ensued on how to name the collection of documents donated by Sutzkever and Kaczerginski, because calling it the Sutzkever-Kaczerginski collection would constitute first-hand evidence that they had smuggled the materials out of the USSR. But not naming the collection after its rescuers would have denied them the most basic form of recognition. Kaczerginski was insistent in a letter to Sutzkever. I believe the formulation, the Sutzkever-Kaczerginski archive, is the minimum for us. We must not allow ourselves to be terrorized. We aren't, after all, in Turkestan. In the end, the collection was named Sutzkever-Kaczerginski, but its name was only mentioned without fanfare in June 1948. Ultimately, Sutzkever-Kaczerginski and the materials went their separate ways. Despite Weinreich's efforts to secure American immigration visas, and even his use of political contacts in Washington, there was no progress on that front. It is likely that Sutzkever's 2-year residence in Moscow and his membership in the Soviet delegation at Nuremberg compromised his immigration application. All the more so Kaczerginski, who was associated with the underground Communist Party in pre-war Poland. Sutzkever's thoughts turned increasingly to Palestine. The possibility of settling there had been on his mind for a while. Even as he wrote to Weinreich from Lodz asking for his help, he also wrote to his brother Moshe in Tel Aviv to ask him to secure for him a Palestine immigration certificate. Sutzkever arrived in Palestine in September 1947, and he sent one of his first letters from Haifa port to Weinreich. You may be sure, my dear friend, that I will help YIVO from here as well, in any way I can. I will also send you the remaining materials. Yes, there was still a large volume of material in Sutzkever's possession. He relinquished parts of Hermann Kruk's Vilna Ghetto diary to YIVO 9 years later, in 1956. And he donated a large collection of Vilna Ghetto documents to the National Library of Israel in the 1970s. Kaczerginski, meanwhile, stayed down in Paris, and he weighed his options. In 1948, he was able to visit the United States as a tourist, as a delegate to the founding of the Congress for Jewish Culture, the Allweltliche Jiddische Kulturkongress. In 1949, Kaczerginski visited the young state of Israel. He eventually settled in Argentina in 1950 to direct the South American branch of the Kulturkongress. The 6-year intimate relationship between these two poets, through the Paper Brigade, through the Jewish Museum, through Poland, through Paris, was over. And the relationship between them and Vilna's treasures came to an end. They had scattered to different continents. An unsympathetic observer might consider Sutzkever and Kaczerginski to have been maniacs who were obsessed with books and papers while the world was on fire and the Jewish people was being destroyed and then reborn. But for these two writers, a people could not survive without its memory and without its culture. The documents were integral to the future of the Jewish people. And for them, the materials from YIVO, the Strashun Library, and the Ansky Museum were a kind of portable Vilna. The city's Jews had been exterminated. The YIVO building was a pile of rubble. The synagogue of the Vilna Gaon was in ruins. But they believed that as long as the treasures survived and could be studied, the memory of the Jerusalem of Lithuania and even the ethos of the Jerusalem of Lithuania would endure. The fact that we are here at YIVO in 2015 is evidence of the power and insight of their vision. Thank you.
Few questions for Dr. Fishman.
We keep referring to them as the two poets. through all of this turbulent time, were they writing? And if they were, what form of poetry? And am I embarrassing myself by not knowing of their poetry?
No, first, the easy answer, no, you're not embarrassing yourself. Yes, both were very prolific in this period. Sutskever wrote some of his greatest poems in this period. Geheimstadt, he has a poem, an epic poem, about a group of Jews who survived underground. Yes, of course, he's writing in Yiddish. This is written. So they're both very prolific in this period, especially Sutskever. Kaczerginski became a labor Zionist, and he writes songs about Chalutzim and about the Jewish people being reborn. They didn't write poems about this activity, as you might imagine. First of all, it's not very conducive to poetry, and second of all, it was really something they were trying to keep very, very secret, so they don't write poems about this side of their life, but they were writing.
I wanted to thank you. I have a million questions. I'm not going to ask you one of them. That story, what a story. What a story. Do you need money?
Let's talk later.
We'll talk.
Every time any lecture here deals with Eastern Europe and Lithuania during the war, every reference to the people mentioned, they all get mentioned once or twice in a book I have that seems to be somewhat encyclopedic in nature. They fought back Yuri Shul, and both of these guys are mentioned in a passing. How active, and that's in connection with some Vilna partisan groups that actually took part in underground military action. How active were they in?
Of course, the focus of this talk was, the saga of the materials after the war. So I was very much compressed what happened, in the ghetto and during the war. So I didn't go into that. But in short, Kaczerginski especially was not only smuggling books on his body, but he was also smuggling arms into the ghetto through different means. And the two are intimately intertwined. I'll give you one example, just one example. The underground in the ghetto had to buy arms. How do you buy arms? From Poles, from Lithuanians. Where do you get the money to buy arms? And what they would do is Kaczerginski would smuggle in a silver Kiddush cup, and they would, or a gold Kiddush cup, and they would melt down the metal, and then they would be able to sell it, in exchange for arms. Sutskever has a famous poem about how they would melt down the lead of the Rum printing house to make bullets. That's a metaphor. No one really melted down the lead from the Rum printing house to make bullets. But what did really happen, and Sutskever knew it, was they would melt down Kiddush cups and other silver gold items smuggled in by the paper brigade to the ghetto so that they could buy arms. Anyway, that's just, I don't want to go, I would do a whole other talk about their activity as partisans, of course.
That was a fantastic talk, and we come from Toronto, Canada, and we've got quite an active Jewish scholarly community, both university and others. What happened to the bulk of the Jewish Ansky Soviet holdings in Vilna that the guys didn't get out?
Well, that's both complicated and simple, but the simple answer is those materials are in Vilnius today. And till this day, they went through a whole long saga of where they were moved to here and there and the other thing. And YIVO is now involved in a monumental project to digitize that material. Maybe the broader answer was Kaczerginski was right, in a sense. For 40 years, more than 40 years, that material was not accessible to any Jewish scholars. From the late 40s till the late 80s, its existence was not really known to anybody. And even now, not all of it is cataloged. And so he was right. For a very, very long time, whatever stayed in Vilnius was not accessible to the Jewish people.
Can you tell us briefly what happened to them and where they lived and so on?
I mean, after I ended
right.
my story? Yes, briefly. Sutzkever went on to continue to be one of the great, probably the greatest Yiddish poet of the 20th century, writing his greatest poetry while living in Israel. He edited the main Yiddish literary journal in Tel Aviv. And he died only, 5 years ago? So he lived a very long life and a very fruitful life as a great Yiddish poet in Israel. Kaczerginski, it's a very different story. He moved to Argentina, and 4 years later, he died in an airplane crash. And that was the irony, the bitter irony was, he had survived the Nazis. Yes, he had been a partisan in the forest, and he'd survived all of that. He had gotten out of the Soviet Union just in time, so he survived Stalin, right? The major Soviet Yiddish writers were executed by Stalin. And then through this twist of fate, he died in an airplane crash in 1954.
David, let me first say shkoyach on the way you tell this saga. I have a question about the organization known as Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, which was charged with the task of placing Jewish books and documents found in Oppenheim and Frankfurt right after the war, and which were under American control. And there was, of course, a debate even then about where these documents should be sent. And some of them, of course, were sent to YIVO. Some of them were sent to the Hebrew University, National Library. Salo Baron, I think, recommended that they be sent to Israel. Can you tell us more about the debate that occurred during those months and years, and how you perceive the outcome looking back on it from now?
Sam, it's a very broad topic, but I'm going to answer part of it, not all of it, but part of it. Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, this organization headed by Sal Baron, their job was to distribute what was called heirless cultural property. Heirless cultural property meant it doesn't belong to anybody anymore. The institution that had this library is now defunct. There was a Zionist library, in Lublin, but there is no Zionist library in Lublin. So who is the heir to that? It's heirless. Or, let's say it's a private book belonging to someone who was murdered by the Nazis, and their children were murdered by the Nazis, and if there were grandchildren. So the whole family was murdered by the Nazis. There are no heirs. This organization, Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, was designated as kind of the heir by the American government for all heirless cultural property. And that was there, and most, YIVO is an exception. It's one of the very few Jewish organizations established in Europe that moved to America and could inherit its own property. But most Jewish organizations were defunct in Europe. YIVO fought very hard, Weiner fought very hard, not to mix up these two issues. YIVO is the rightful owner of its own property. It has nothing to do with the endeavor of Jewish cultural reconstruction, because this is material that has an heir. It has an owner. It's not even an heir, it's an owner. It's the same entity. We were there in Vilna, we're here in America, we want our own property back. So there was tension between YIVO and Jewish cultural reconstruction about the YIVO material. Fortunately, the American government recognized the right of YIVO for its own property and didn't hand it over to Jewish cultural reconstruction.
Großen Dank, David. I'm here.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I want to ask you a question about a third character here that we saw on one of the photographs, Chaim Grade. And I know that the last novel he published in the forwards was called Von unter der Erde, which was about that period. And one of the main characters was, I don't know what he's called, but it's Shmerke Kaczerginski, basically.
Correct.
And my question is, what was his role in this? Was he involved in the smuggling? Is there any evidence from the correspondence in the Grade archive about his role in this whole operation? And how was his relationship to Shmerke and to Avram Sutzkever?
Well, the last is simplest. They're very close. I mean, especially Shmerke was friends with everybody. He was Mr. Popularity among Yiddish writers and among other people, so everybody thought they were Shmerke Kaczerginski's best friend, including Chaim Grade. Sutzkever and Grade is a more complicated relationship, a bit competitive there. To my best knowledge, and I haven't examined the Grade archive, but I would have seen this, Grade was not involved directly in this story. He didn't smuggle materials across the border. He got to Vilna. He was in Central Asia during the war. After the war, he got to Vilna rather late. Literally, Kaczerginski was packing his bags as Grade arrived. But he lived through the story in its second and third chapters. He was in Lodz together with Sutzkever and Kaczerginski, and he was in Paris together with Sutzkever and Kaczerginski. So I have no evidence that he was directly involved in the story. But you're right, it made such an impact on him that he twice wrote novels about it. One is buried in the press, it's never been published in book form. It's called Freuen von Ghetto. And the other is, again, also buried in the press, not published yet in book form, this Von unter der Erde, which is a reworking of Freuen von Ghetto. So the story made a profound impact. I mean, for him, right, Von unter der Erde, from under the ground, it's both about retrieving the books from under the ground, and it's about starting life from zero, as if you're cavemen, walking out from under the ground. I mean, that's a metaphor of starting life. So the story had a tremendous impact on him, but to my knowledge, he wasn't part of it.
We're going to take a couple of more questions. Excuse me? Okay. Excuse me?
What happened to the material that was found in Frankfurt?
Just to clarify, the material that was found in Frankfurt was in the American zone of occupied Germany, and the American military authorities, after hesitation and hemming and hawing, recognized YIVO in New York as the rightful owner of YIVO materials. Correct. Exactly.
Give it away to any library.
Your question is the most controversial question. It's not a simple question at all. from a scholarly perspective, you're absolutely right. For a scholar, in fact, a digital copy is better than the original. It's easily accessible. You see it online. Often, even the quality of the letters is better. But, you know, if your mother passed away and all you had, you know, was one or two, I don't know, pictures or a letter, would you be satisfied with a digital copy? You would. Well, you're one of the few people I know like that. If it's all I had from my deceased mother, I'd want the letter. So on an emotional level, when so much has been destroyed and very little has survived, you don't want to settle for a copy. But that's the difference between the scholarly needs and the emotional needs. The project is a multi-year project. I think it's a 6 or 7 year project. It's very much more complicated than even what I described. So it's going to take several years. Oh, I think it will happen. It will happen. It's not the Soviet Union. Right.
Okay, one last question.
Can you say a little bit more about their personal qualities? You said Kaczynski, for example, was glad, easygoing kind of a guy.
Yeah.
What else could you say about them in terms of their personality characteristics?
Okay, you're right. That's something to add. In the framework of this talk, I couldn't go into that. You know, Kaczynski, on the one hand, was everybody's best friend unless you know, there was a conflict, and then he could turn and, you know, fisticuffs and fight. In other words, and when he had political views, he didn't hesitate to express them fully. You know, from a communist, he became the strongest anti-communist. A lot of his old friends became his enemies, because after the war, he told them, the Soviet Union, what he thought about the Soviet Union. That's Kaczynski. Sutzkever is a more pensive, intellectual type, and also very refined. You could have seen the clothing he wore, you know, man of taste, man of refined taste. Not easy conversationalist, you know, very much into himself. I would say more writing was his mode, more of in conversation. So they're very different from each other. Very, very different from, and so what's so interesting that they were, you know, basically lived together, you know, and experienced everything together for these 6-7 years through the ghetto, and then back, you know, to retrieve and in the forests, and you know, so they're like brothers, even though they're so different from each other.
On that note, please join me in thanking Dr. Fishman for tonight's talk.
Thank you.
Please also join us right in the Great Hall for a reception.